go ahead and hit record, Sandy. We will get started.
Okay, I think we are ready to record, and I again wanted to welcome everybody to the webinar. As Heather mentioned, I'll be moderating the session, so please feel free to ask questions throughout the session by entering them in the chat, and I'll make sure that we round all of those up and get Heather's answers to all of those. And also, there's a poll on your screen. Please take the poll. And without further ado, we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks, Heather.
All right. So my name, for those of you who don't know, is Heather Lansky. I am the Manager of Data Quality Reporting for the EHE Office of Research. I am also one of the Qualtrics Division Administrators here at EHE. Um, we will dive right in. I like to begin these with a little spiel about the Office of Research. We do several of these workshops throughout the year, and we've done several of them on Qualtrics. You can always find the archives of our past sessions on our website. These sessions on Qualtrics are meant to be kind of quick little explanations of certain features of Qualtrics. It's not really intended to be a replacement for the Qualtrics University and the help that's available through Qualtrics. I can help with certain difficult or complex survey questions, or if you have something specific, but I just don't have the bandwidth to be the full-time Qualtrics support person. I have uploaded today's slide deck in the filed session, and I have also uploaded a handout on using shibboleth authentication, which is something that we will talk about towards the end of today's session. So we're going to talk about survey flow and understanding blocks and how they work and how branching with blocks works, and using that authenticator with the shibboleth authentication through osu.edu. But before we get too far along, I wanted to make a quick note that the Qualtrics has a little bit of a new look. As far as I can tell, it's only cosmetic, but if it's been a while since you've logged into it, it might be a good idea to go in and look around and just make sure you can still find everything. As far as I can tell, like I said, they've changed their logo and they've kind of I would say it's cleaner now. They've taken away a lot of the blue, so it looks to be just cosmetic. So survey flow, I divided it into two parts because it's a fairly robust section of Qualtrics, and I thought there was just too much to cover in one 30-minute session. So today we're going to talk about what it is and what it isn't, how it's different from skip and display logic, and let's get started. So here's a little chart about the differences between skip logic, display logic, and survey flow. Skip logic and display logic are really intended to be controls on a single question. Skip logic for sure, that just controls what happens on a single question. You set it on the question that you're on, and you can decide that you're going to skip the respondent to a future point in the survey depending upon their answer. You can only set one condition. So if this, then they go to some future point in the survey. Display logic is a little bit different. It's almost the opposite of skip logic. It sets a condition that's going to display the following question based on a response. With display logic, you can set multiple conditions. And how survey flow differs from that is instead of controlling individual questions, it controls an entire block of questions. So survey flow is really meant for studies or surveys where you're going to send different respondents down pretty different paths. So if you have maybe an intervention in a control group, or there's two pretty defined groups that are in your survey. You can do some other things with it, but that's really what it's intended for. And you define that at the block level. And again, multiple conditions can be set on that. So here's an example of skip logic. So you've set the condition on the previous question. We've set it that if they select male, it's going to skip the pregnancy question and go on to the education question. So it's a very simple, they answer this way, then they skip to some other part of the survey. You can also use skip logic to end the survey for a participant. So if they answer no to the very beginning, you can skip to the end and then they can exit from there. Display logic, this is how you set display logic. You set it to display the question. So you define that logic on that question, and In this case, I've set two different conditions. So if your age is over 55 is not selected, and if your sex female is selected, then we'll ask the pregnancy question. Whereas survey flow sends our females and our males down completely different blocks. So you'll notice there that the block for females has 7 questions and the block for males has 5 questions. So we're giving the females and the males completely separate questions, and then everybody returns to the everyone block. I'm just kind of giving some examples of survey flow here, and then we're going to break it down here in just 1 second. So by default, your survey contains one block. You can see that in the survey design view. Up in the corner, it says default question block. You can rename that block to be whatever you want it to be. I usually rename them to things that make sense to me. So this is the intro block. This is the demographic block. Short little names. They do come into your data in a weird header kind of way, but I try to keep them still pretty short. And then beneath this, you'll see the survey flow. This is how the survey flow looks in the survey flow window. It shows you, show your block, default question block. This is how all your blocks will view. So this is really where you customize where your respondents go and what they see at the block level. You can rearrange your blocks so you don't have to create them in a linear way. If you create a block and then you need to add another block or move questions within blocks, you can certainly do that. The survey flow really works at the block level. If you're moving questions between blocks, you need to do that in the regular design view. But then you get into survey flow and you can rearrange the whole blocks in different ways. Respondents start at the top of the flow and they work their way down until they reach an endpoint to finish the survey. So when you're in the survey design window, to add a new block, there's a question at the end of after the last question that you've created. There's a click box for add block. Sorry, I need a little drink of water there. So once you click add block, then the block is created. And as you can see, you can name the block. You just click on it to give it a name, and then that name of that block will appear in your survey flow. Survey flow can get complicated very quickly, so it's best to keep up with your naming as you go along, so that it makes it clear to you when you get into survey flow what you're looking at. So this is what a survey flow would look like with several blocks defined. Right now it's set that the blocks just follow one right after another, and that's what these arrows right here mean. It means they do this one, and then this one, and then this one, and then this one. And then you can add something new after that. But there's no real logic defined here. This is just, what a regular survey would look like without survey flow defined. So if you're going to add a flow, you click on the block that you want the flow to follow. You click Add Below, and then you can choose what you want to add to the flow. So today we're going to talk about blocks and branches and the Authenticator. And in part 2, we'll talk about embedded data, randomizer, web service, table contents, and conjoint. End of survey. I would use end of survey here if you're doing separate blocks. If you're just doing a screening and your first question is yes or no, I would end the survey there using skip logic. But this is really defined for if a block screens out or if a block has to end for some reason. You can define customized end of survey messages for that. Everything in survey flow is really designed to work at the block level. It's really not designed to be individual question level. So in this case, we're going to click branch, and when you click branch, you get the branching icon, and it says it won't be triggered until you add a condition. So you click on Add Condition, and you can begin selecting your branching conditions. There are several different conditions that you can add, and then over here you can add and subtract all your layers of conditions. So this is what a completed branch flow would look like. So you've got your default question block, then we're branching. If they're female, then they show the block for females. If they're male, then they show the block for male. And then everyone, once they've completed these two branches, they come back here to the everyone block. This can get fairly, as I say, fairly complex. And when you have, like this one here, we have two defined branches. We have a female branch and a male branch. If you only had one branch here, the logic goes kind of if then else. So if female, then branch to the block, else continue on with whatever is down here. So you don't have to define pairs of blocks. It can be, you could just send a female branch here, and you wouldn't have necessarily have to have a male branch, except that if you have separate questions specifically for males. So with the different branching options, the first one you have is embedded data, which we will talk about embedded data on our May 1st Qualtrics Corner. But if you've set your embedded data, you can branch it to be equal to that embedded data, not equal to. There's a whole list of things that you can define what happens with the embedded data and how that relates to the block that you've defined. This might be where you would specify if they're intervention or control group. You can set it up any number of different ways. The next one is device type. So you can send folks down a different path based on what device they're using to respond. So if they're coming from a mobile device, if you want to have specific questions for folks that are using Apple devices, there are some surveys that this is important for. I haven't really seen it in a research context. It's really, Qualtrics is still built for really sales and customer satisfaction. So some of these functions that are built in here, I'm not really sure how you'd use it in a research setting, but it's entirely possible. You might have a study on iPads, and you could branch folks out that way. You can set quotas in Qualtrics, so you could branch folks down a path if your quota has not been met, or if it's greater than a certain number. You have to define the quota first, because there's this select button where you would select what quota you have defined. So define your quota first, and then you can use it in your branch logic. You can use IP location. So if you say already had a contact list defined and you had folks in different cities or different states, you could send them down different branches based on their geolocation. And again, it's the same kind of, is equal to, not equal to types of things. And the first one we had seen obviously was questions. So you define which question that you're branching off of. So now we'll talk about the Authenticator. Authenticator is for authenticating if the respondent is coming from an osu.edu domain. So anyone with a name.number could authenticate through the Authenticator. There really aren't any other options for Authenticator other than this shibboleth login, because that's what OSU uses for their web authentication. So if you're going to use Authenticator, this shibboleth login is the only option that you have. So when you log in and you set up your survey flow, you can say branch on successful authentication. The authentication type this stands for single sign-on, and that's what we have, and it's just a part of a drop-down. And then you can associate this respondent with a panel. So if you already have a contact list defined and you've got these people in there, you can associate it with what you have in the panel. That would be useful if you had additional embedded data in your panel that you needed to also pull from. Or you can just capture the respondent identifying info as it sits, or you can do both. The benefit to doing the capture respondent identifying info is it captures that for you. So you don't have to ask a separate question for their name, their last name, their email address. It will capture that right with your data. If you want to additionally capture that and give them a chance to edit it, you can put that in, and I'll show you how to do that in a slide or two. And again, this single sign-on type is shibboleth. If you don't check this capture box, you don't associate with the panel, it will be collected anonymously. So if you wanted to send out an anonymous survey, but you wanted to make sure that all of your respondents were coming from within OSU, you wouldn't leave it. You would leave all those checks, all those boxes unchecked, and then when the surveys came in, they wouldn't have any identifiers on them. But you would just know that they authenticated that the respondent did come from an OSU email address. So when you have triggered that authenticator, this is the first thing the respondent will see. When they hit your survey link, they will go right to this login required where they will use their typical credentials to log into any other OSU website. And then once they've authenticated, they will proceed with your survey. In this example, I have included this edit box where I am piping in the data that has come from the authentication. So that's coming from central OSU records. And then I'm giving them a chance to edit that if something's not correct. That's totally optional to you if you want to do that. If you want to add additional fields onto that, it's kind of a nice double check way of making sure that the person that's responding to the survey is the person that authenticated in. I don't know that there will be too many instances where that wouldn't happen, where that wouldn't be different, but it's also a nice personalized way that the person knows that you know who they are. And then when you do that, regardless of whether you capture it here or not, when you collect your data, it will pulls in everything that came from the central record. There are several things you can capture from the central record. You can capture first name, last name, full name, email, department ID, but the department ID that comes in is the numeric org number. It's not a text field of what their department is. And you can also capture major. If it's a student, you'll capture their major. The caveat with department and major is that both of those categories are multiple lists. So you could have multiple majors, you could have multiple appointments within departments, and what comes into Qualtrics is only the first one on that list. You don't get everything that's there, you only get the first entry. So that's a little warning about that. Most commonly, you're going to use first name, last name, email, and maybe full name if you're going to use that. In the attachment that is loaded up into the file repository has all the codes that you need to gather those different informations. There are specific codes that you have to put into the Authenticator to tell it this is what I want the email, and it matches the code that's on the central record system. So that that attachment really has all of that information that you need, and you just copy and paste that into the Authenticator. So once you've got that Authenticator set up and you're ready, if you want to capture that, pipe that data onto your survey, in your question where you say your information, there's an option for add default choices. So you click that and then it gives you your form here, and you can click embedded data field, and then you type in whatever that embedded data field is that you set. And you define those yourself. I should back up a slide. Here. So when you are setting this up, you are defining these names. You are making this up to be whatever you want. This is what goes to the university system. So this number, this code belongs to first name. So you could call this F name, you could call it first, whatever is going to make sense to you. You name this anything, but then you have to use the exact identifier that's in the list in that document to tell it what you want out of that. With these names, the naming convention recommendations that I would give you is no spaces, no special characters, lowercase, and don't begin them with a number. Those are all just kind of standard best practices for data collection for variable naming. So you just follow that when you're setting up your authentication. We'll go back to here. So we've defined those embedded data fields. So for first name, you want to tell it enter embedded data field would be first name. And then each one of these has a drop-down arrow that leads you to that pipe data option. So this is what it looks like in the survey design side. You've piped in the data, this beginning little code here, the E stands for embedded data. So you're piping in embedded data from the field first name, embedded data from the field last name, embedded data from the field email. When you get comfortable with this kind of coding, you can code it right in here. You don't have to use the drop-down menu widgets. But I've done it for a long time, and I still sometimes don't always remember what the syntax is. So I still tend to use the drop-downs. And that's all I have. I know I kind of went through that very quickly, but we only have 30 minutes, and I want to make sure that I leave time for questions. So if there were questions, Sandy, could you send them my way and we'll.
Excuse me, Heather. So far, I haven't seen anything in the chat, but I have a
Okay.
couple of questions on my own that I'd like to get things
Okay.
started, and then I'll keep an
Sure.
eye on the window there. When you were talking about blocks, I was curious. I know this seems like a pretty basic question, but why create blocks if you're not going to be doing branching? What are the ways that you use blocks other than for flow reasons?
Okay. That is a good question. Let me pull up my sample survey here. There are a couple of things that you can do with blocks that don't necessarily have anything to do with survey flow. So one of those is loop and merge. A loop and merge is a section where you're going to ask the same questions repeatedly based on a response, on a previous response. You'll see this commonly in sales type scenarios where you'll say, how often do you shop at Kohl's? And then you say, what section do you shop in? And you say, women's section. And then for every response of what section you shop in, they repeat the same questions over and over. So how often do you shop? What do you buy there? In a research setting, I could see that being useful for medications. If you're collecting different kinds of medications that folks are on, you would say, how often do you take ibuprofen, or what the dose and the brand and all those kinds of things. So I used it personally when we were collecting data for the P12 inventory, where I was asking folks about their programs that they had in P12 schools. So I would repeat the block of questions asking about the location of where those things were. So I would have them say, okay, add another school and add another school and add another school. And it's just looping through the same questions over and over. The downside to loop and merge is that on the back end, the data export is a little bit messy. So unless you had a really strong use case for it, I would tend to stay away from that. I mean, obviously if you're going to collect 50 different medications, that would definitely be a use case. But if you're only going to repeat the questions a few times, I would probably stay away from loop and merge just because of the kind of the mess that it has on the back end.
Okay.
Um, the other reason that you might create blocks is blocks on the survey preview side. Blocks create a new page. So if you had really definite sections within your survey, where you had a demographic section and then maybe you had a socioeconomic section, or really clearly defined sections, you could do it that way so that there's a clear change of topic within your survey. The downside to that is that you can't use the back button between blocks. So once they've moved on to the next block, they can't go back to previous blocks.
Interesting. Okay.
Think of any other.
I'm still not seeing anything in the chat window, and
Okay.
so everybody feel free to ask some questions. While I've got the floor and the microphone, I'm going to ask another one myself.
Okay. Sure.
Okay, so it looked like the shibboleth authentication was part of the block structure also.
It's part of the survey flow. That's
Yeah.
correct. So I'm in Qualtrics now, and I go into survey flow, And if I wanted to add it fresh, it's this Authenticator button right here.
Okay.
So you click
So
that and then you start to set that up.
so does that mean I can authenticate at any point during a survey if I wish to do that?
You can. I haven't honestly done a lot with authentication. The instructions that I've received from Qualtrics on it is that authentication is the very first event that happens.
Okay.
Um, you authenticate first, and then you define what happens after that. I think there are some additional settings that you can do with these options. So you can set how many times they can authenticate before they fail,
Hmm.
what the prompt is, if they error out, what does this say, and you can define all that within your library of messages, just as you do with a survey invitation or a thank you message. You just define this as an authentication um, message. So you could I think in theory there would be a way for you to branch them if they don't successfully authenticate. You could branch them into another section.
Oh, okay. Any other questions out there? The group is quiet.
Hopefully, I didn't overwhelm everybody. I know I breezed through that, but that's why I wanted to divide this into two parts because there's a lot to survey
Yeah.
flow. Um, there's this whole other group of things that we haven't even touched on yet.
Mhm.
30 minutes
Looks like a
isn't
question
very
coming in
long.
right now.
Okay.
So hang on for a minute. I know I want to go play with these functions and see what I can do with them.
Yeah, it is a lot of fun, and I do highly recommend testing. Test and test and test again. And if you're setting up authentication where it's really important that somebody does authenticate, and people from the outside can't get into your survey, have your spouse or your child or a friend try to get into the survey that shouldn't have credentials to make sure that the authenticator is working the way that you expect it
That's a
to.
good idea.
This is a fairly new feature of Qualtrics. In the previous times of Qualtrics, when each department had their own installation of Qualtrics, this wasn't possible. But once the university went to an enterprise system, then this authentication became a possibility. And I don't use it as much as I probably should. There are a number of surveys that I do internally within EHE that I really should be using authentication for.
Hmm. Do you find that graphical interface of the flow to be adequate when you're trying to set up a complex flow, or do you generally do that off in another software program before coming in here and trying to figure it out?
If it's complex, I might do it outside of Qualtrics first and just
Hmm.
really talk it through the if then else logic of it. The interface is a little dodgy when you have a lot of branches in here and to see what's happening. Um, just remembering that the branch they always return from outside of the branch unless something in the branch unless you have a end of survey in your branch after the branch happens, they're always going to return to the next outer level of what's going to
Okay.
happen there. So um, if all else fails, just keep testing, 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 testing until it behaves the way you want it to.
Okay. Now we have a question from Paul. He has a survey with a question he would like to skip based on the answer to a previous question. Which would be better, the skip or display logic?
If it's just a single question and you're just if the answer to that question skips them to another place in the survey and there's no other associated questions with that response, I would definitely use skip logic.
Any other questions out there? Well, thank you, Heather, so much for a great webinar. And you've all have Heather's contact information. So if you have any follow-up questions, be sure to give her a email or a call, and I'm sure she'd be happy to help you.
Absolutely. And we did record this, and there are the attachments for you to download. So if you need to come back to this at any time, you'll find it on the EHE Research website.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks, Heather.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.
Oh,
Oh, do we have another question?
looks like we have some
Okay.
typing. Oh, they're
Okay.
thank yous.
Thank you. Thank
Thank
you,
you all.
everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye.